Welcome to Radio Edict. My name is Noor Sabharwal and I am co-editor of the Opinions Department. Today we will be talking to Yauvanika Chopra, Associate Director of the New India Foundation. The NIF is co-hosting Bhashavaad, a conference on translation on the 23rd and 24th of August in collaboration with the Ashoka Centre for Translation. The NIF, based in Bengaluru, focuses on the writing and translation of nonfiction in India. Our conversation today will centre on the current state of translation and its way forward. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Yauvanika.
Thank you, Noor, for doing this.
I wondered if we could get started by talking about India's legacy of translation and the importance of translation in a country as multilingual as ours.
Yeah, I think, as you've already said, the key word here is multilingualism, and I think India has had a long history of being able to exist with several different languages. And so I think what that suggests about also the multiplicity of ideas in India, and obviously everybody talks about how diverse we are as a country, and that's best reflected in its languages. So for various reasons, I think that the fact of being historically multilingual has led to us having a sort of natural translation consciousness. You'll find that most Indians are bilingual inherently. Some have been trilingual, even though now, and I find Peggy Mohan's argument very interesting in this, if you've read Wanderers, Kings, Merchants, that a lot of the younger generations in India are moving now towards diglossia, which is to say it's not even bilingualism, but rather a hybridized preference towards English because it's a more profitable language. But given our generational heritage of multilingualism, I think that's an interesting change that we're seeing, but yeah.
Perfect. So could you then take this sort of forward into how we can capitalize on this existing translation consciousness to talk about the current state of translation in India, just generally the landscape of the kind of existing networks?
Yeah, you mean informal publishing networks?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think in formal publishing, if you look at the landscape, a lot of the translation that's been done and that's been very successful has been with fiction. And I wouldn't say this is an India-specific phenomenon. I think in general, the work that tends to travel best is fiction. So even when you look at the current success of Korean books, for example, a lot of the books that are doing really well are novels and things like that. It's quite rare, I think, for non-fiction books to really become very big unless they happen to be self-help or sort of universal in that sense, So in India, I think you've had some early successes. Of course, like if you go back long enough, in non-fiction, you'd have somebody like Mahatma Gandhi who wrote Hind Swaraj in Gujarati, and as you know, then deliberately, he translated it on his own to English because he wanted the British to be aware of what was being written. And then in fiction, you have Tagore translating a lot of his work. And then even after independence, you have somebody like Quretulan Haider in Urdu who is translating her own work, but in that process altering it so much that actually what you'd call it is a transcreation, because it's almost very different from what it was originally. So you have this long history of translation, beginning with lots of self-translation, and then with somebody recent like say Vivek Shanbag with Ghachar Ghochar, you have lots of collaborative patterns in India, like Shanbag and Srinath Perur have collaborated on so much work that they've got a sort of their own miniature translation consciousness at play in a sense, which is also really exciting to witness. And of course, I think recently, because the Booker Prize award to Geetanjali Shri for Ret Samadhi, translated by Daisy Rockwell, that's brought in a lot of spotlight to translation. So I think it's wonderful. There's also been smaller projects like the Indian Novels Collective. They were looking at translating 100 works of fiction from Indian languages to English. But overall, I'd say, as you can tell even from this sort of brief and scattered history, a lot more of the focus has been tilted towards fiction. So what we do at the New India Foundation is we try to focus obviously a lot more on the non-fiction aspect of it, a lot more on knowledge texts, things like that. And that I think is still unfortunately a nascent ecosystem in India, but because it's nascent, it has much more potential, I suppose.
We'll come back to a lot of the points that you spoke about, but I wanted to ask you also about data access in terms of translation, that there is a report being launched at Bhashavaad this weekend, but I wanted to ask about existing data frameworks just for knowledge sharing on this landscape of translation.
Yeah, I think there are lots of informal data sharing networks. There's also formally, for example, the National Translation Mission does have quite a large database. I'm not sure about accessibility, but I know that some of these exist, and there are also some very exciting projects that have been taken up by citizens themselves. So there are lots of websites which we can we were discussing maybe hyperlinking them to our Bhashavaad website as well. So yeah, I would say that a lot of this stuff does exist, but it tends to be a bit more piecemeal, and for various reasons, it has also, I think, not been too accessible to somebody who's generally interested in translation. So that's where we also decided to come in and create, one large compiled database. And I think another aspect of what we are looking to do is to make it as collaborative as possible. Because, the thing with trying to create a database of all the non-fiction texts in Indian languages is that this is a mammoth, one would argue, never-ending task. Because no matter how many people you send out and no matter how diligent they are, you will always have books that are missed out on. And I think the only way to sort of overcome that is to have more and more people like you and people and more people who are not in the ecosystems that we belong to either. So outside of just urban areas, etc. Like, how do you get more people to contribute to this project by saying, I was cleaning out my grandfather's closet and I found these 3 books, and here's a picture of the books and you might want to add them to the database. That's actually, I think, the way forward. And then, being able to digitize those books and all that, which is a larger project. But yeah, I think on that level, on that scale, I don't think anything has really been done, which is open access.
Sure, makes sense. So, it's wonderful to hear about the aspirations for the database. Could you talk about the current scale of it a little bit?
Yeah, the current scale is, of course, it's designed to be very ambitious in the future, but the current scale is already what we've been able to compile is a fairly large database of over 10,000 works listed by different languages. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the limitations of what we've achieved, because I think it is a huge accomplishment. But I will say that it's the first step of a project that we hope will really take root and spread much more. So, for example, just one of the things that I do think is relevant to mention is that, and this tends to happen all the time, as you know, with the New India Foundation as well, is that we end up focusing on languages which are literary and linguistic ecosystems of their own. So say, for example, Bangla, Marathi, Kannada, these are languages that are fairly well represented even in their own publishing industries. And so then what happens is that smaller languages, like say Kashmiri, you just will not have that same, the numbers are hugely different. And so that's a flaw that you will find in this database as well. But it's something that we're aware of and we're hoping to correct actively. So yeah, not to sound, I think I'm very optimistic about where it could go.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is, the first step. And then, actually very ambitiously, what I would hope for is that at some point we'd be able to really tap into the languages which don't have scripts of their own, and so you'd have to transliterate and then add them. So for example, I've been thinking about Uttarakhandi languages a lot. So say, of course, there's Kumauni, Garhwali, which are still somewhat translated, but then you have dialects like Jaunsari, which have not been brought into larger consciousness at all. So I would hope that we're able to tap into that as well at some point.
Wonderful. Sounds amazing. So I wanted to also lead our conversation towards a broader view of translation generally, because the NIF and the ACT are working towards more innovative solutions towards translation. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the intersections of AI and technology with translation, the kind of work that's being done. How does this find space with translators? How are you working to supplement the work of translators with technology?
Yeah, I think, one platform that we've been working with is Anuvad, which, what they've been doing is trying to create a database and that Anuvad actually is open access, so anybody can go and use it, and they have, I think, currently language capacities of 12 Indian languages, but I believe they're also planning to scale up quite rapidly. So we've been working with Anuvad. As you already have mentioned, the point of working with AI for languages is not to replace translators, which can never be done, but to somehow be able to supplement their work. And ideally, one of our trustees wrote about this recently. The idea is that at some point you should be able to, for example, watch a YouTube video and select not just that your captions show up in different languages, in Indian languages, but that you have subtitles, that the audio itself can change into different languages, etc. So I think not just Anuvad, but lots of parties are working towards that. One of the apps that I find fascinating is Karya, which is being led by Manu Chopra. I think they're doing some really fantastic work, and there was a profile on them recently. So I think as a broad ecosystem, there's a lot of optimism, and we've been trying to work with them to the degree possible at the NIF, but again, there's certain limitations, but I think we're always open to the idea of keeping that spirit of collaboration alive, or even if we aren't able to directly collaborate, what we aim to help with is being able to have database systems that are open access. So they are very welcome to use those and collaborate with us on that.
In terms of databases also, I mean, this is sort of an unrelated note, but one of the things that I believe you spoke about earlier to do with the NIF fellows is where does translation find space in the context of the country in terms of, like, let's say the distinction between rural or urban areas. So I wanted to ask about how databases can help sort of bridge certain gaps locationally, but also like where translation infrastructure exists in India today.
I would say that it's at a nascent stage, the infrastructure right now, which is also what we're trying to correct, etc. And as I said, I think it is a booming, the potential is yet to fully take off. But to answer your question about in terms of geography, how would that impact? I think the huge advantage of having more things digitally available, having more things as an online archive or as an online capacity, I think the huge advantage is that then it doesn't matter where you are in India. It doesn't matter if you're based in Delhi or in Tumkur, because you can access the same material and you can research the same way, and you're not constrained by not being able to visit a large archive. And unfortunately in India, a lot of the large archives, as you know, are very urban, and so it shouldn't be that just because you aren't there, you aren't able to work in the same way. So that's a huge reason to accelerate the amount of data that we're able to digitize, or the amount of data sets that we're able to present.
Okay, alongside digitization, I think an important concern to think about is globalization. So I wondered if you could comment a little bit about the development of English as a lingua franca and how that impacts the importance of translation.
I think it's tricky, right? Because it's so it's such a thin line, because on the one hand it's very useful. Even in India, you have all these conversations about English as a bridge language. In translation, for example, oftentimes now instead of Hindi, people are translators are using English as the bridge language. So it's a thin line because it's so different though from the way an Indian language might be constructed. However, I think that one of the huge advantages of any successful lingua franca, whether that's English or Hindi or anything else, is its ability to take loan words and its ability to incorporate from other languages. And so I think in this, because look, I mean, not to sound like a pessimist, but a lot of this globalization is inevitable. And what I was saying about hill languages also, the fact is that the younger generations just don't speak those languages, and they don't have formal infrastructure to learn them as well. So if you aren't speaking them, they're lost. And yes, is that a terrible tragedy? Absolutely. But what we can do is also, instead of I think giving up entirely or being entirely cynical, I think one relatively easier thing to do is to bring certain words into the ambit of generally spoken languages, whether those are English or Hindi. So maybe that's one aspect of it. But I honestly, I don't have a solid answer on this, because I'm hoping that in globalization we won't end up losing our languages entirely. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this, of course, like diglossia is a linguistic phenomenon that can be observed now. But I also feel that usually when your backs are against the wall is when you have to sort of you bring your history back, in a sense.
Makes sense, because I was going to say, like, in an abstract sense, when you think about globalization, it feels like a move away from local specific linguistic traditions. So the question that I guess is quite unanswerable is, how do you foster that transition in a way that's healthy, so that like the positive impacts of globalization are felt,
I think
while also maintaining local linguistic traditions?
I mean, my first answer to this would be technology. Like, I think it would be hugely helpful if you had better translation technology readily available. And this is again an example
because of like democratization.
Yeah, just if you exactly, you democratize the technology. So you're not existing in a bubble, no matter where you are. So say for example, all the NIF books that we publish. Now, I think of course our NIF books right now are written only in English, and our translation fellowships they aim to bring in knowledge texts from Indian languages, but that's English. Also to English. which is, part of our constraints, etc. But the fact is that if those books that we're publishing in English, if we could have quicker translation, simultaneous translation. So, for example, one of our books right now is about, all of them actually speak to different regions, speak to different languages. So that would be really exciting in itself as well. Is that, if you have that, it doesn't take away from the importance of the English language text, but it adds to it because it becomes like a book that we're about to publish on the history of Karnataka. I would love to see it also available in Kannada at the same time. So then you'll be able to discuss it not just with people who speak English, but with people who speak Kannada, which, since we're in Bengaluru, is lots of people. So you'd be able to have that exchange of ideas at a deeper, more profound level. And I think that would be even better. It would certainly enrich our mission. And I think in general would be a useful thing.
Yeah. Makes sense. So, you've sort of answered my next question, but if you have another answer or multiple answers, I just wanted to ask you about, generally, in a broad sense, what are your hopes for Indian translation as we approach India at 100 in the next few decades?
I hope it becomes so much larger as an ecosystem. I hope we are able to include languages which right now seem impossible to involve. As I said, say something like John Sari. Clearly, that's what I'm thinking about right now. But I think there are so many languages like that, and it's a real pity that they have not been included in the formal ambit at all. Even when people are interested, because there just seem to be so many structural impediments to all of that. But I hope that through technology and through more than that, I think it's also a cultural willingness to look at your own language as a matter of pride rather than a matter of shame. I think a lot of Indians carry shame about their own languages because English is so aspirational. It's so deeply aspirational. It's not just how you speak it. It comes down to the accent and all of that. And I think it's such a pity to carry that burden of essentially, an insecurity around with you. It takes up a lot of unnecessary space. So I hope if there's also that cultural shift in looking at our own Indian languages as certainly very worthwhile and as carrying a wealth of knowledge that would enrich if it were added to our daily vocabulary, I think that would be hugely helpful. So my ambitions are huge. I would hope that as we move towards India at 100, we're looking not just at the big Indian languages, but at smaller Indian languages. And I'm also hoping that those languages are well represented on a global stage, because I think Indian literature has so much of value, and I think it has to be pitched correctly, and I think it would be wonderful to have more people engage with it.
So, just to close by grounding some of that wonderful ambition, could you talk a little bit about the New India Foundation's Translation Fellowship?
So the New India Foundation's Translation Fellowships began quite recently. We're in round 2. We just announced we've given 4 fellowships to Urdu, Gujarati, Hindi and Tamil. And we're very excited about the 4 books and the 4 translators who've just joined us. For each of these, as for the last round, which we had awarded to Kannada, Bangla and Marathi, I think the works themselves are very, very important, and also strangely not a part of larger consciousness, even though say in a larger language like Hindi, the author we're translating is Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, who's I think broadly well known, but not really engaged with at this level of his general ideas and things like that.
And then in terms of also the network that the Translation Fellowship has created in terms of the Language Expert Committee, could you talk a bit about that? Because I'm sure we'll see the impact of the books as they come out over the next decade and continuously, but that's something that has begun and is already having impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that we have these language experts associated with us, and they're really the reason that the translation fellowships have been able to take off, is because they've given their time and support to the project. I think their expertise has been invaluable, because it's then you're engaging with scholars who are looking at India, I think, with this sort of multiplicity that comes in when you're also deeply engaged with Indian language texts. So I think just hearing their insights has been wonderful. I think their insights have been very valuable, not just with regard to the NIF translation fellowships, but also in terms of understanding how the Indian language publishing industries work in the non-English spheres, which I have to confess is something personally I didn't know much about, and I'm still very keen to learn more about it. And so that's something that I think has been hugely helpful, and which has come about because of them. So in terms of the network, it's really, I think, helped our NIF fellows expand their ideas considerably. I think one of the things, even at Bhashavaad, that the reason, say for example, somebody like Raza Kazmi I find so interesting on a panel is because I actually heard Raza talk at NCBS last year, and see, this is where translation is actually genuinely, it makes sense in so many use cases, because what happens with Raza is he's working on conservation, but therefore he talks to many people in say Madhya Pradesh, and now how indigenous practices might be towards conservation are only expressed in their own languages, and so to be able to translate that to a larger book about what seems to be a larger topic, but links back to that, links back to how the people themselves view the idea of conservation, not as something that is externally imposed, but as something that's very natural and normal. And so I think in that sense also, see, that's where you could get lots of very rich loan words from, as an example. And so that's something I'm looking forward to hearing discussed at Bhashavaad, is the ways in which knowledge is translated, not always through formal text, but through even specific words, through specific concepts, and you have to be able to translate those into a larger consciousness. Or someone like Rahul Sarvate, who's translating Sharad Patil, and Sharad Patil in himself had a very interesting life, basically trying to see how you could synthesize Marxism in India with incorporating not just the class question but also the caste question, because you cannot in India look at it as purely economic without a very specific cultural aspect to it. So what Sharad Patil synthesized is this whole new ideology essentially, and what Rahul does, I think, is to bring, it's not therefore just a translation, it's an introduction of a thought pattern which actually has influenced it was considerably significant to a section of people in Maharashtra at the time of its publication, and it did lead to a sort of cultural shift in that specific population, but it was never, for example, the ripple effects didn't reach, say for example, Delhi, where I studied later, so I would never studied the work of Sharad Patil, which is, I think, frankly a shame, because why is it that in, for example, in general, in undergrad, etc., like we should be studying Indian thinkers, and we should be studying how Indian thinkers have interpreted. It's not to say that you stay in a silo, it's to say that you can look at global thinkers as well through the lens of how Indian scholars perceived them, and I think that makes for a more immediate experience culturally and intellectually. So I mean, I think I'm so glad that Rahul is translating this, and I'm so glad we're able to help with it, because Sharad Patil's work should be known more broadly, and it should be known better. I want to say that it is important to have multiple languages and to have multiple ideas, because it's, especially say, so even in the context of globalization, for example, India has always had a variety of ideas coming at it. Like, it's always been several ideas nestling together and somehow not being at odds with each other. So in that sense, globalization is just a larger version of something that we're already used to. And multilingualism has suggested precisely that, has suggested this ability to coexist with multiple different truths, multiple different perspectives, etc. And so a return to being able to think in not just one language and not just in a linear fashion in that one language is, I think, better civilizationally as well. It's better for us as a I was going to say species, but that's,
multilingualism, but also thereby translation, because it's often viewed abstractly as a way to singularize culture, especially as you move towards like a broader global lingua franca like English. But realistically, it's actually the maintenance of diversity and a representation of diversity, because you're committing yourself to the diversity of ideas and diversity of voices, despite moving towards a language that's accessible to all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what, as we were discussing, that's why English has been successful as lingua franca, because look at the amount it's expanded, But I think the point of translation is to make meaning of something, and as you pointed out, it's usually to singularize, but actually we're constantly translating all the time anyway, because even translating from thought to word, even though, say for example, we're both talking in English, but I know what I'm thinking is very different from the sentence that will eventually come out, So, because it's a translation from here to here already. But if we were able to break into other languages in the middle, perhaps it would be richer for it, or, perhaps I'd be able to capture something specific that maybe I'd be using 50 words for in English,
So we need to think of translation as a broader act of not just one language to another, but rather the translation of cultures.
It's ideas,
So it's not necessarily viewing it in this binary way of we're moving from one text to another text that these certain people can access, but instead just a broadening of access. It's a broadening of communities, of everything.
Yeah.
A broadening of the self.
You've already
broadening
said
of the self, like you said, that it's a translation of your own ideas. Come to Bhashavaad this weekend.
Come to Bhashavaad this weekend. Like, share, comment, subscribe.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Edict. Stay tuned for more episodes.